You've probably never heard of the Hudson Street Saloon, but you should have. On September 1st, 1872, this modest New York tavern transformed from a forgotten watering hole into the epicenter of a crime that dominated newspapers for months. As the city woke that morning, early patrons nursed their drinks, completely oblivious that they were about to witness murder and become part of a story that would climax with one of America's most legendary prison escapes. William J. Sharkey was born in New York City around 1847 and came from a respected and well-to-do family. A physical description of him in his late 20s stated that he was about 5 feet 7 inches, 5'7", tall, had high cheekbones, dark hair, and a thin face somewhat feminine in appearance, the eyes sharp and clear. Contemporaneous sources described him as handsome, well-dressed, interesting, and confident. Yet despite his privileged upbringing and natural charisma, young William chose a different path. Sharkey decided at an early age to adopt the flash life of a burglar, pickpocket, gambler, and sporting man. The New York City of Sharkey's youth was a place of stark contrasts. Magnificent brownstones lined the avenues where the wealthy promenaded in their finest attire, while just blocks away, tenements teemed with desperate immigrants struggling to survive. It was a city of opportunity and corruption in equal measure, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single night at the gaming tables, and where political power was often bought and sold like any other commodity. Sharkey's early adulthood coincided with the rise to power of William Tweed, whose Tammany Hall political machine had seized control of the city and engaged in systemic political corruption. Sharkey and his gang soon came to the attention of Tweed and his associates, who saw an opportunity to feed Sharkey's ambition while serving their own goals. The young criminals' gang, known as Sharkey's Guards, had established their headquarters at the corner of Worcester and Houston Streets, and they were making enough noise in the underworld to attract the attention of the city's most powerful political boss. With their assistance, Sharkey became a politician of no mean influence. He was a power in the 8th Ward primaries, had a club named after him, and belonged to every influential political organization in the 5th Congressional District. It was a remarkable rise for someone who had started as a common pickpocket, but in the New York of Boss Tweed, such transformations were not only possible, but commonplace. The city ran on a system of favors and kickbacks, where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was punished swiftly and severely. The saloons of New York served as unofficial political headquarters where deals were struck over whiskey and beer, and where the real business of running the city was conducted far from the prying eyes of reformers and newspaper reporters. It was in these smoky back rooms that Sharkey learned the art of political maneuvering, watching as ward bosses distributed patronage jobs to loyal supporters and collected tribute from gambling houses and brothels. But Sharkey's political career would not follow the trajectory he had hoped. Sharkey's political career appeared to wane, however, when he was defeated by internal dissensions in the Tammany Party. He was nursed and petted until all his lambs had been brought into the fold, and then Tammany betrayed him. Sharkey returned to his old ways. After this, he gave up hopes of office and devoted himself to the pursuit of his ordinary avocations, gambling and stealing. In 1872, Sharkey traveled to Buffalo, New York, and invested in a faro bank, a popular card game in 19th century America, but also a game widely known for rampant cheating by both players and dealers. He lost $4,000 in 5 days. The loss stung not just financially but personally. Sharkey had always prided himself on his gambling acumen, and to lose so spectacularly was a blow to his reputation among the sporting men of New York. He then returned to New York City and recruited an associate named Robert S. Dunn, a professional gambler who also held a position as a public servant in the office of the comptroller. Sharkey provided him with $600 to win back the money that he had lost. Dunn apparently lost as well and returned to New York City empty-handed. Robert Dunn was, in many ways, a mirror image of Sharkey himself, a man who straddled the line between respectability and criminality, holding an official position while engaging in the underground economy of gambling and graft. Their friendship had been forged in the gaming houses and political clubs of the city, where such dual identities were not only accepted, but expected. Summer turned to autumn, and the debt remained unpaid. The next time that Sharkey and Dunn were in the same company was at the funeral of James Riley, a politician known to both men. They marched in the funeral procession together and subsequently convened with other friends at a local bar. Funerals in 19th century New York were elaborate affairs, especially for politicians. They served not just as occasions for mourning, but as displays of political power, with various factions marching in formation to show their strength and solidarity. The saloon at 228 Hudson Street was typical of such establishments. A long wooden bar polished to a shine, sawdust on the floor to absorb spills and tobacco juice, and mirrors behind the bar that reflected the gaslight and made the narrow space seem larger than it was. The air was thick with smoke from cigars and pipes, and the conversations ranged from politics to horse racing to the latest scandals involving Tammany Hall. According to one source, Sharkey accused Dunn of reneging on his obligation to repay him, even though Dunn had recently won $1,500. The confrontation began civilly enough, with Sharkey approaching Dunn at the bar. Witnesses would later testify that the two men had been drinking together earlier, seemingly on good terms, engaging in what observers described as their usual joking and larking. On the afternoon of September 1st, 1872, Sharkey met Dunn in a saloon located at 228 Hudson Street and demanded the $600 due him. Dunn stated that he could not pay it, and Sharkey drew a pistol and killed him almost instantly. He shot and killed Dunn, then fled. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the saloon, causing patrons to dive for cover behind overturned tables and chairs. Dunn crumpled to the sawdust-covered floor, blood pooling beneath him as the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted as men shouted for help and rushed to see if anything could be done for the wounded man. But it was too late. The bullet had found its mark with deadly precision. Sharkey remained at large for only a short time, having made it known to the police that he wanted to surrender. He was arrested by Captain Ira S. Garland and placed in a Manhattan jail to await trial. His decision to surrender rather than flee the city entirely was calculated. Sharkey knew the New York justice system well enough to believe that with the right lawyers and the right jury, he might escape the gallows. Sharkey's trial was a sensation at the time. Each day, large crowds convened to catch a glimpse of the accused. The trial was covered extensively by the New York Times. The courthouse was packed to capacity each day, with spectators arriving hours before the proceedings began to secure a seat. Women in their finest dresses sat alongside working men who had taken time off to witness what promised to be the trial of the year. Sharkey was charged with premeditated murder, a crime punishable by death under state law. His defense attorneys argued that Sharkey indisputably killed Dunn, but there was no way to know if it was premeditated. The jury could thus only find him guilty of manslaughter. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated revenge, arguing that Sharkey had gone to the saloon with murder in his heart, seeking out Dunn specifically to settle their financial dispute with violence. They pointed to witness testimony that Sharkey had been heard making threats against Dunn in the days leading up to the shooting, and that he had been seen checking his pistol before entering the saloon. The defense, meanwhile, sought to portray The shooting as a tragic accident, the result of a heated argument between old friends that had spiraled out of control. They emphasized Sharkey's apparent intoxication on the day of the shooting and argued that in his impaired state, he could not have formed the specific intent necessary for a charge of premeditated murder. During the trial, one witness declined to answer on fear of self-incrimination whether he had been bribed with $500 to give testimony favorable to the defense. This revelation sent ripples through the courtroom and the press. If Sharkey's associates were attempting to buy favorable testimony, it suggested both the depth of his connections and the lengths to which he would go to avoid the hangman's noose. Trial proceedings revealed the complex web of relationships that connected New York's political establishment to its criminal underworld. Witnesses spoke of gambling debts and political favors, of meetings in backrooms and money changing hands under tables. It was a window into a world that most respectable New Yorkers knew existed, but preferred not to acknowledge. On 21st June 1873, the jury found Sharkey guilty of premeditated murder with a recommendation to mercy. The recommendation for mercy was significant. It suggested that while the jury believed Sharkey was guilty of the crime as charged, they also recognized mitigating circumstances that made the death penalty seem too harsh a punishment. The defense requested a retrial on procedural grounds, and the court convened again on the 23rd and 29th of June 1873 to consider the motion, which was ultimately denied. On 3rd of July 1873, Sharkey was formally sentenced to be hanged on Friday, 15th of August 1873. Sharkey seemed unmoved by the proceedings. According to accounts, he did not betray the slightest emotion and appeared in the best of spirits. This composure, in the face of death-puzzled observers, was it bravado, a performance for the crowd? Or did Sharkey know something that others didn't, that his connections in Tammany Hall might yet save him from the gallows? One of his attorneys then filed a formal appeal which was granted on 7th of August 1873. The appeal bought Sharkey precious time, postponing his execution date and keeping him in the Tombs rather than sending him to the gallows. It was during this period of legal maneuvering that Sharkey's remarkable story would take its most dramatic turn. Sharkey had been confined in a prison adjacent to the courthouse called the Tombs throughout the trial and sentencing. The Tombs was one of New York's most notorious institutions, a massive Egyptian revival structure that loomed over Center Street like a monument to human misery. Built in 1838, the prison had already acquired a fearsome reputation by the time Sharkey arrived. Its official name was the New York Halls of Justice and House of Detention, but everyone knew it simply as the Tombs, a nickname that captured both its architectural style and the fate that awaited many of its inhabitants. By most accounts, he was a troublesome inmate. One author noted he became so violent in his demonstrations that Warden Johnson ordered that he be locked up and put in close confinement, and that Sharkey was continually insolent and abusive to his keeper. The Times reported that Sharkey attempted to stab one of the prison keepers. He was placed in solitary confinement and kept under close surveillance, and the door of his cell remained closed except to receive meals. This should have been the beginning of a harsh regime designed to break Sharkey's spirit and prepare him for his eventual execution. But the reality of life in the Tombs, especially for someone with Sharkey's connections, was far different from what the authorities claimed. Yet, some accounts implied a life of relative luxury and privilege. Walling noted, "The cell was richly fitted up, and the occupant evidently was not leading a very restricted life." On 6th August 1873, the day before Sharkey's appeal was granted, he was reportedly found under the influence of intoxicating liquors, though from what source these have been obtained the warden has been unable to find out. The corruption that permeated New York City's government extended into every corner of the tombs. Guards could be bribed to look the other way while contraband was smuggled in. Cells meant for punishment became comfortable quarters for those who could afford to pay. The prison operated on an economy of favors and payments, where everything from extra food to conjugal visits could be arranged for the right price. Enter Maggie Jordan. While Sharkey was confined in the tombs, his sweetheart, a rather good-looking young woman named Maggie Jordan, was a daily visitor and brought him books, flowers, and cigars. Owing to her apparently exemplary conduct, she made a favorable impression upon the prison officials, who rather admired her for her loyalty. Maggie Jordan was no ordinary woman. In an era when respectable ladies were expected to distance themselves from criminal associations, she stood by her man with a fierce loyalty that impressed even the cynical guards of the tombs. She arrived each morning dressed impeccably, her manner refined and courteous, carrying baskets of provisions and small luxuries to ease Sharkey's confinement. But Maggie was more than just a devoted sweetheart. She was, according to various accounts, an accomplished pickpocket in her own right, someone who understood the criminal world as intimately as Sharkey himself. Their relationship was built not just on romance, but on a shared understanding of life outside the law, a mutual respect for each other's skills and cunning. The guards at the tombs grew accustomed to Maggie's daily visits. She became a familiar figure, exchanging pleasantries with the turnkeys, inquiring after their families, always maintaining the facade of a respectable woman devoted to her unfortunate lover. It was a performance worthy of the finest actress, and it would prove crucial to what was to come. All visitors to the tombs were provided with tickets upon entering, which were collected when they passed out through the gate. This system was meant to ensure that everyone who entered the prison also left it, preventing escapes and maintaining security. But like many systems in Tweed's New York, it was only as strong as the honesty of those who operated it. As summer turned to autumn in 1873, Sharkey's execution date loomed. The appeals process was grinding forward, but few believed it would save him from the gallows. The evidence against him was strong, the jury had spoken, and public opinion demanded justice for Robert Dunn. It seemed that William Sharkey's criminal career was about to come to its inevitable end. But Sharkey and Maggie had other plans. Throughout the long months of his imprisonment, they had been carefully observing the routines of the prison, noting which guards were attentive and which were lax, studying the patterns of visits and the procedures for entering and leaving the tombs. What they planned would require split-second timing, steady nerves, and more than a little luck. November 19th, 1873, dawned cold and grey, with a bitter wind blowing off the East River. On November 19th, 1873, Miss Jordan called on Sharkey at 10 a.m., as had been her daily custom since her lover's incarceration, and spent several hours with him as usual. But this day would be different. At noon, a Mrs. Wesley Allen called to visit her husband, also a prisoner. Mrs. Allen was seen to stop in front of Sharkey's cell and converse with the prisoner and his sweetheart. Mrs. Wesley Allen was no stranger to the criminal world. She was the wife of a burglar and the sister-in-law of John Allen, who owned a notorious dance hall on Water Street and was known throughout the city as the wickedest man in New York. Her presence at the tombs that day was not unusual. She often visited her imprisoned husband, but on this particular day, she had a different purpose. The three conspirators had choreographed their movements with the precision of a ballet. Each person knew exactly what they had to do and when they had to do it. The slightest deviation from the plan could result in disaster, discovery, arrest, and for Sharkey, a swift journey to the gallows. Miss Jordan left the tombs at 1 p.m., and Shortly afterward, a woman dressed in black and heavily veiled passed out after delivering her card to the turnkey. It did not take long for them to piece together that Sharkey was the peculiar-looking woman who had exited the building at 1:30. The transformation had been swift and complete. In the privacy of his cell, with Maggie and Mrs. Allen shielding him from view, Sharkey had shaved off his distinctive moustache and donned the women's clothing that Maggie had smuggled in beneath her voluminous skirts. After Sharkey had vanished, the guards recalled that Maggie's skirts had looked extra bulky when she got there, but they assumed that she had been wearing an extra petticoat or two to help keep out the November chill. The woman who emerged from Sharkey's cell bore little resemblance to the convicted murderer. Dressed in a black coat and hat, with a heavy veil obscuring the face, the figure moved through the prison corridors with a practiced feminine gait. Her face was concealed by a veil, but she was later described as large and rather masculine in appearance. The last sighting of Sharkey was from a guard who noticed a peculiar-looking woman jumping aboard a fast-moving streetcar. The guard later remarked that he was somewhat surprised to see the nimble way in which she alighted on a car, which was going at the time at considerable speed. It was this athletic leap that first aroused suspicion. What woman in heavy Victorian skirts could board a moving streetcar with such agility? Meanwhile, back at the Tombs, jail guard Kennedy stopped her and asked for her ticket. After fumbling in her dress for some time, she stated that she must have lost it. Mrs. Allen played her part perfectly, appearing flustered and confused, searching through her pockets and reticule with increasing desperation. Johnson detained Mrs. Allen and then ordered a walk-through and inspection of the prison by the guards on duty, and that was when they realized that Sharkey had escaped. A search was made of the prison, but the only thing unusual found was Sharkey's empty cell. Some of his prison garb was there, and the authorities also found the condemned man's black moustache, which was still wet with lather. The cell that had been Sharkey's home for months told its own story. His prison uniform lay discarded on the floor, and on a small shelf, the remnants of his freshly shaved moustache provided mute testimony to his transformation. The escape was considered the most daring and unparalleled break jail in the history of this country. The authorities were stunned. How had a condemned murderer simply walked out of one of New York's most secure prisons in broad daylight? Speculation immediately arose about accomplices. The Times speculated that Sharkey had the assistance and cooperation of persons equally as skilled as himself. That source cited a rumor that 2 guards had been placed under arrest. The investigation revealed the depth of corruption within the Tombs. Guards who had been on duty that day suddenly found their stories didn't quite match up. Questions arose about how Sharkey's cell door had been opened. It should have been locked, yet somehow it was found ajar. The manner in which his cell door was opened always remained a mystery. According to one account, Jordan had taken an impression in wax of the lock on her lover's cell, and assisted by Sharkey's confederates outside the prison, had managed to have a key made. If true, this suggested a level of planning and sophistication that elevated the escape from a desperate improvisation to a carefully orchestrated operation. Mrs. Allen was detained pending further investigation, and Miss Jordan was arrested that evening. Mrs. Allen was released from custody without being charged. Miss Jordan was charged with assisting a felon to escape, but was never convicted, although it was generally believed that these 2 women smuggled into the prison the disguise worn by Sharkey, and that he used Mrs. Allen's pass. $2,000 reward was offered for the body of the escaped felon, but Sharkey was never seen again. The reward was a substantial sum for the time, equivalent to several years' wages for a working man. Posters went up across the city describing Sharkey in detail and warning that he should be considered armed and dangerous. The superintendent of police thought The plan of escape has been arranged for some time and was not a thing of a moment's decision, as the prison authorities would pretend. This assessment seemed accurate given the coordination required and the various elements that had to come together perfectly for the escape to succeed. But where was Sharkey? Sharkey remained in New York City for several weeks after his escape. This was perhaps the most audacious aspect of his flight. Rather than immediately fleeing the city, he hid in plain sight, likely sheltered by associates from his criminal and political past. New York in 1873 was a city of neighborhoods, each with its own character and loyalties. In the Irish wards where Tammany Hall held sway, a man like Sharkey could find plenty of doors willing to open for him, plenty of people who remembered favors done or who simply admired his daring escape. The police might search, but in the tenements and back alleys of Five Points or the Bowery, their authority meant little compared to the code of the streets. Sometime between late 1873 and early 1874, he booked passage to Cuba under the name Frank Campbell aboard the schooner Frank Atwood. The choice of vessel was not coincidental. The Frank Atwood was known in certain circles as a ship whose captain asked few questions about his passengers, provided they could pay in cash. Cuba had no extradition treaty with the United States. This made it a popular destination for American fugitives, a place where a man with money could live comfortably beyond the reach of U.S. law. The island was still a Spanish colony, and the Spanish authorities had little interest in helping American law enforcement. Coincidentally, William Tweed, Sharkey's one-time boss, also fled to Cuba aboard the Frank Atwood in 1873 after escaping from jail, where he was imprisoned for corruption charges. The mighty boss Tweed had fallen from power, brought down by the reform movement and the cartoons of Thomas Nast. His flight to Cuba aboard the same vessel that carried Sharkey seemed to symbolize the end of an era in New York politics. Sharkey lived for a while in Cuba, allegedly visiting the American consulate in Havana to read about himself in the New York papers. This detail, if true, reveals something of Sharkey's character. Even in exile, he couldn't resist checking on his notoriety, reading the breathless accounts of his escape and the ongoing manhunt. His source of income remains unknown, although he seemed to have plenty of money, and in answer to some inquiries made, he stated that his brothers furnished him with all he wanted from New York. Whether this was true, or whether Sharkey had managed to secret away funds from his criminal enterprises before his arrest, he appeared to live comfortably in his Cuban exile. Jordan joined Sharkey in Cuba around 1876, and they subsequently married. Maggie's arrival in Cuba marked a new chapter in their story. She had waited 3 years, enduring suspicion and surveillance, before finally making her way to join her lover in exile. Their wedding, conducted far from the city where they had met and schemed together, was both a culmination of their romance and a final severing of ties with their former lives. In March 1875, it was reported that Sharkey was arrested while trying to sail to South America, and his return to New York was imminent. The news caused a sensation in New York, with newspapers preparing special editions to cover the return of the famous fugitive. But the reports proved to be false, or at least premature. Sharkey remained at large. In July 1896, 21 years after Sharkey's supposed extradition, an article appeared indicating that Sharkey had entered the military service there. If true, this suggested that Sharkey had found a way to reinvent himself completely, trading his past as a criminal and politician for a new identity as a soldier in the Spanish colonial army. In June 1900, 28 years after Sharkey's escape, the Auckland Star reported that Sharkey was located in southern Spain, where he is eking out an existence as a guide, and the police have information which should result in his capture. By this time, Sharkey would have been in his early 50s, a far cry from the dashing criminal who had escaped from the tombs. The image of him working as a guide in Spain, perhaps showing tourists around the Alhambra or the streets of Seville, seems almost pitiable compared to his former life. In March 1931, at which time Sharkey, if alive, would have been about 88 years old, Asbury wrote simply, "They never found Sharkey." And with those 4 words, one of New York's most notorious criminals passed from history into legend. The story of William J. Sharkey's escape from the Tombs captures a moment in American history when the line between law and lawlessness was often blurred, when political power and criminal enterprise walked hand in hand through the gaslit streets of New York. It was a time when a man could rise from pickpocket to politician, when the right connections could open any door, even the door of a prison cell. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sharkey's story is not his escape itself, but what it represented. In an era of rigid social hierarchies and limited opportunities, Sharkey's transformation from condemned killer to mysterious woman to vanished fugitive seemed to embody a peculiarly American dream. The dream of reinvention, of leaving one's past behind and starting anew. The Tombs prison, where Sharkey made his escape, was eventually demolished, replaced by newer, supposedly more secure facilities. Tammany Hall's power was broken by successive waves of reform. The New York that Sharkey knew, the city of boss tweed and corrupt politics, of gambling dens and political machines, gradually gave way to a more modern metropolis. Yet questions remain. How exactly did Sharkey's cell door come to be unlocked that November day? How many guards and officials were complicit in his escape, and what became of William J. Sharkey in his long years of exile? Some say he lived out his days peacefully in Cuba or Spain, growing old under an assumed name, perhaps sometimes telling stories of old New York to people who had no idea who he really was. Others believe he met a violent end, that his past eventually caught up with him in some foreign port. The truth, like Sharkey himself, vanished into the mists of history. But there's one more twist to this tale, one final revelation that casts the entire story in a different light. Among the records of that era, buried in courthouse files and newspaper archives, there exists a curious document, a letter allegedly written by Sharkey himself years after his escape, sent to a former associate in New York. In this letter, Sharkey claimed that the shooting of Robert Dunn had indeed been accidental, that in the heat of argument and under the influence of alcohol, he had pulled the trigger without meaning to kill his old friend. He wrote of the guilt that haunted him in exile, of dreams where Dunn appeared to him, not angry but sad, asking why their friendship had ended in blood. Whether this letter was genuine or a forgery, whether Sharkey truly felt remorse or was simply crafting another deception, we cannot know. But it reminds us that behind the sensational headlines and dramatic escape, behind the image of the dashing criminal and cunning fugitive, there was a human being who had taken a life and spent the rest of his days running from the consequences. Maggie Jourdan, the woman whose loyalty and cunning made the escape possible, deserves the final word in this story. Years after Sharkey's death, whenever and wherever that occurred, she was reportedly interviewed by a journalist who tracked her down in a boarding house in Havana. By then, an elderly woman, she had outlived her infamous husband and the era they had inhabited together. When asked about the escape, she smiled and said, "People always want to know how we did it, what the trick was. But there was no trick. We simply loved each other more than we feared the law." When you have that kind of love, prison walls become like paper and guards become blind men. William knew I would come for him, and I knew he would be ready. The rest was just details. She paused, then added something that seems to capture the essence of their story, and perhaps the essence of that wild, corrupt, magnificent era of New York history. We were criminals, yes. We were not good people by any measure, but we were alive in a way that most people never are. We took what We wanted from life, and when life tried to take William from me, I took him back. That's all. That's everything. And perhaps that is indeed everything. A love story wrapped in a crime story, a tale of escape that was really a tale of devotion, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of human society, in the midst of corruption and violence and betrayal, the human heart can still surprise us with its capacity for loyalty and courage and audacious hope. The fog rolls in off the harbour now, just as it did on that November day in 1873, when a peculiar-looking woman in black boarded a streetcar and vanished into history. Somewhere in that fog, perhaps, the ghost of William J. Sharkey still runs, forever escaping, forever free, forever lost to the justice he fled and the love that saved him.